Welcome back to the Unifying Force. This is the third episode. I'm Gavin, joined by Gio.
Hey, this is our third go, third time lucky, three's a magic number. Let's not jinx it. Let's hope to have a really good talk now about self-fulfilling prophecies. Go, chapter.
Yeah, so self-fulfilling prophecy. Sum it up really quick. Self-fulfilling prophecy is where you find out something about your future. You don't want it to happen. The steps you take to avoid that fate lead straight to it, meaning if you didn't find out about it in the first place, it wouldn't have happened. A similar issue would be you genuinely want something to happen, you have a positive attitude, and sure enough, that ends up coming to pass anyway. One famous example of this in Star Wars is when Palpatine foresees that Luke will be his downfall, and the very act of telling Darth Vader this sets in motion the chain of events which allows this to happen. Another such event would be in the prequels, where Anakin foresees Padme's death in childbirth, and the steps he takes to try and avoid that end up leading to him becoming so much of a monster that sure enough, Padme does die in childbirth from a broken heart, or so they say. Sequel trilogy, we have Luke Skywalker foreseeing evil things in his nephew, and because he's so preoccupied worrying about that, when he goes to read his nephew's mind, that's all he can see, because he's been so bitter and working himself up about that, and so the steps he takes to try and avoid that, sure enough, turns Kylo to the dark side. It's the last straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. We see it again with Sifo Dyas, the guy who foresaw the future. He was paranoid that war was coming, the council wouldn't allow him to create an army, so he went around them and made one anyway. And of course, as we know, that turned out with the Clone Wars. And then as we see also in the sequel trilogy, Snoke is constantly coddling Kylo and telling him he's going to be this next great king, so to speak, this next great leader. Even his name, Kylo Ren, translates to new king. And sure enough, by filling him with all of that confidence, he inadvertently gives Kylo the incentive to kill him and take his place, allowing these things to come to pass. We see this in our everyday lives too, in the form of like good luck charms. Of course, a good luck charm doesn't actually do anything. It's just somebody's preconceived notion that it's going to help them, that if they don't have it, they're panicking so much they're not able to focus on the task at hand, and sure enough, they will fail, and they will blame the fact they don't have a good luck charm, or vice versa. Oedipus is another famous Greek myth about this, of course, Oedipus's parents decide to go to fortune teller against the advice of their friends and neighbors. Fortune teller tells them a newborn son is going to grow up to kill the father and marry the mother. They're so petrified they decide they're going to go drown the baby in a well, but they can't bring themselves to do it, so they end up giving it to the farmer who owns the well. But through another series of crazy events, Oedipus ends up growing up and killing the father and marrying the mother anyway, in what is a very disturbing and psychological type story. But I just found that was really interesting that, Star Wars has all these self-fulfilling prophecies, and they all end up having major implications for the story as a whole. What do you think about all that, Gio?
I think you're very right. It's one of the key, maybe just below the surface themes that runs through, in huge strands through the entire Star Wars saga. Not just the main 9 Skywalker saga films either. It's just a common underlying theme behind all of George Lucas's creation so far, and hopefully it will be continued to be touched upon, explored, and then dissected by people like us. So, just specifically taking things back, so self-fulfilling prophecy is a phrase that I guess a lot of us would be familiar with, even if you're not really having a deep dive into literature or classics or philosophy or Star Wars. So the kind of standard definition from what I know is simply just to say it's the phenomenon or the feeling when you feel something, or one thinks or feels, there's a gut instinct telling you this is going to go and break this way. And you think, that might not be to my desire. I don't want that to happen. But by obsessing over it, which you inevitably do, it materializes and happens, and you feel powerless and vulnerable, and also probably regret and shame for not being able to change the flow of events. And that's exactly what Anakin feels in many ways, and is essentially the big black dog of depression that bothers him throughout his time as Darth Vader encased in the black armor. He feels, and he is responsible for the death of his entire family. But he took it all because he took it on a gamble, on an old avuncular man's whim, which was the Senate Sheev himself, when Palpatine offered him this Faustian deal. So by Faustian, I mean the so-called deal with the devil. That's quite a popular phrase and idiom in English and in many languages and cultures. And that comes from the play Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, who is a relatively unheralded, superb author in Elizabethan England, I think, maybe a little bit prior to that. He's one of the many people that scholars feel might actually be the real Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is just a name created by the First Folio Company to be the kind of banner and brand behind these historical and comedic and tragic plays. And of course, this all links really heavily to Star Wars, not just in this chapter, but in all our chapters of Unifying Force and to Star Wars generally, because you might read a film review of one of the prequel films from 2002 or 2005. I remember reading Revenge of the Sith, and it was when I first discovered Rotten Tomatoes, the summaries they have from critics for film reviews, as well as the tomatometer, whether it's fresh or rotten. And the summary for Revenge of the Sith was all very similar things, saying, oh, it's a Shakespearean tragedy, or it's a Greek Odyssey, with a heavy tragic element. And Anakin is, guilty of hamartia and ego, and his fatal flaw is that he loves too much and has too little power to stop events from happening the way he thinks they might go. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. Self-fulfilling prophecy. It's what, Catherine, you've already touched upon with Oedipus, and there are so many examples in Hellenic mythology. There's Sisyphus, who was cursed with always, I think, pushing a boulder up a mountain that he never could manage, and so he was always in pain and suffering and not quite death. And he was bound to that existence because of his wrongful actions in the eyes of, I think, the Olympian gods. So, in Star Wars, specifically, Darth Maul is the analog to Sisyphus, because he's somebody who's kind of on the wrong side of things, has a few things that don't go his way. He's always trying and endeavoring, putting everything in, physically, emotionally, philosophically, spiritually, but he just keeps getting broken down and chewed up and spat back out by the universe again and again and again. And you see that just from the Phantom Menace. He's just a tossed away secret apprentice who doesn't fulfill Palpatine's wish of Darth Sidious of destroying the two Jedi Knights, Jedi Master and Apprentice, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. But he's just an old screwdriver. He's tossed aside into the garage. Nobody cares about him anymore. He's disposed of. The way his body falls limply into the energy pit in the Palace of Theed on Naboo at the end of the Phantom Menace. But remember, if you watch the Clone Wars and Rebels, he has much greater role than this. But he's always suffering. He's always struggling. He's always experiencing huge emotional pain. He must have a lot of PTSD anyway. And you learn that he's been stripped from his mother, sold into slavery, forced to become a tribal warrior, forced to physically, gruelingly execute these labors on Dathomir as part of this kind of tribal culture they have. He has to fight and kill his brothers to earn the right and privilege to be the leader of his particular tribe. And then Palpatine comes along and wants to find an apprentice from, the Night Sisters, but then he finds out that one of them's strong in the Force from the male tribe, and that becomes Maul. So Darth Maul's existence is tragic, almost as much as Anakin's. Maybe more so in some ways. And in a few different aspects they differ, but they're both fantastic examples of almost Hellenic level mythology, self-fulfilling prophecies. So I've been speaking a lot, so I'll shift it back to Catherine.
Yeah, that is interesting because of the way that Palpatine likes to manipulate people that way as well. Like when he tells Anakin that, oh, the Council doesn't trust you, they're always going to hold you back, and he does that because he wants Anakin to sort of assert himself, because Palpatine knows that that's not going to fly with the Jedi Council. And
Yeah.
sure enough, that's like when Anakin makes the suggestion that, oh, Palpatine, the Chancellor says I should lead the assault on General Grievous. And of
Yeah.
course Palpatine knows he's not going to go for that. And of course when Palpatine asks him to be put on the Jedi Council, he knows they're not going to grant him the rank of Master because that's not how it works. And so both of those things and those rejections for Anakin get him even further upset and get him to trust Palpatine even more. So it's like another, it's like it's a perfect self-fulfilling idiom in a way that this is for sure going to happen. Kind of like you mentioned with Darth Maul, his whole life is just because he's so obsessed with vengeance, and really for him it was not so much that he hates Obi-Wan just because Obi-Wan beat him. It's because everything that he had grown up to that point was manipulated by Palpatine. So when Palpatine dropped him like a rock, he just couldn't handle that and decided to take it out on Obi-Wan. And he's never able to change. And it's like, well, your entire philosophy of violence and hate and rage is just going to keep leading down these paths of failure. So it's like a prophecy in its own is just going to keep recycling and going on and on over and over again. Yeah, exactly. But that also leads back into what the Force does as well, because the Force kind of nudges things in this direction. Like in the Episode 1 being, of course, chronologically the first one, not the first film released, you'll find that more often than not in that film, characters are saying like, "Oh, trust in the Force," or the Force works in a mysterious way, or the will of the Force is something that you have to deal with. And you can see how the Force is willing things in a particular direction, because it's like, oh well, if we give somebody this prophecy, which the origins are laced back in the expanded universe, they're not as solidified as much in the saga itself. But because we put our faith in these things which we don't really understand much about, we'll go through hell or high water to make sure it comes to pass. And sure enough, the Force does as well. That's just like a really different kind of idea. And we see that again even in the original trilogy with Luke. Because Yoda and Obi-Wan want Luke to murder his father. And reading between the lines, that's the real reason that Obi-Wan did not tell him that Vader, or that his father is Darth Vader. Like when he says, oh, well, Luke, it's from a certain point of view. And it's like, no, it's not. You just didn't want to tell him because that's not going to be conducive to him killing this kid like you want. And yet it's Luke, in a way, taking in this message he's been told over and over again about don't go down the dark path, don't go down the path of violence, that ends up causing him to have the revelation that, wow, this is right, I have to reject this, and sure enough, it ends up moving the story forward in a positive way. And it's just kind of neat that a lot of the characters' decisions are fulfilled by these things that they're working up in their heads, or these other ideas, and it's like, I wonder what what the writers think about this, because surely George Lucas is very much steeped in mythology. The hero's journey, as we know, he kept sharing every draft of his script with Joseph Campbell to make sure he was getting this down. And while self-fulfilling prophecies, again, are a thing, they're not, see, I got that same edition on my shelf. But it's like, because like I mentioned, the Oedipus one is probably the most famous of the ancient self-fulfilling prophecy storylines, but it's not the only type of storyline, but they use it just a lot in Star Wars, and it makes me wonder, is the Force sort of causing these things to happen? Like, did the Force give Luke the idea to be really paranoid about his nephew? Did the Force kind of convince Palpatine that, no, you need to tell your apprentice about the fact that his son's going to kill us? And that's like an interesting question, because you can argue that, well, it could be the character's own actions and their own beliefs that do this. But on the flip side, because of the whole will of the Force and the way it's nudging things, maybe the Force is doing it, which would lead you into conversations about places like Mortis and the World Between Worlds that seem to exist outside the astral plane on an astral plane, rather, outside the space-time continuum. And it opens up the door for these fascinating questions about the origins of the Force and how it relates to the saga as a whole. Because when you have so many self-fulfilling prophecies to direct the story, it almost makes you wonder if there's some higher being that we haven't heard about in Star Wars who's writing the story in real time. Kind of like the Wills in the original draft.
Definitely, yeah. It's interesting, because I just came up with a little meme a little bit earlier, and I'm trying to remember it. A little mimetic phrase you can turn into a few gifts, just for fun. Maybe you can put it on merchandise. Self-fulfilling prophecies, but they seem to be the two primary ones we discussed, which are very Hellenic in origin, and Oedipal and Sisyphean are Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker, with his future as a kid, being released from slavery and being a Jedi Knight, and sailing between the stars, then his mother dying, and then his wife dying, and their children dying in childbirth with her. And then with Darth Maul and his wish for violence and then acceptance and then a place in the universe and then revenge, which it should be against Palpatine and Darth Sidious and the Sith and the nascent Empire, but really it's more directed towards Obi-Wan and Anakin in the Clone Wars, especially the Siege of Mandalore, when it's all misplaced. And it shows that although he's a very intelligent, nuanced, conflicted individual with so many layers, and he's very philosophical and spiritual and politically aware and quite morally conscious, he's not a classic black and white villain at all. And I don't think there are many in Star Wars, which is what makes it very interesting. Although it's good versus evil, light versus dark, there's so many shades of grey. And even with Darth Maul, who on the surface looks, like a Halloween demon, but he has a lot of introspective moments, and his dialogue delivered by Sam Witwer is very meditative. Whoever wrote it, Dave Filoni, Jon Favreau. So I think it's really fascinating. But just going back to my meme phrase, Palpatine is directly involved in Maul and with Anakin, and they're Oedipal, they're a bit like Sisyphus. They are like the classic Greek mythology, Hellenic, self-fulfilling prophecies. Palpatine's first name is Sheev. It's a Sheev fulfilling prophecy. Sheev has these wishes. Sheev sees a young guy. Sheev grooms them from being a little kid. Sheev gets them to be his apprentice. And then Sheev feels fulfillment that his journey towards exacting revenge against the Jedi and destroying them and eradicating them and outlawing them and creating a new safe galactic empire with himself at the top, captain of the Imperial ship. That's what will give him fulfillment. Although, ironically, in a serious way, he will never feel fulfillment. He'll never feel joy or happiness, because that's the whole problem with the dark side. That by submitting to the will of the dark side, or the anger, rage, and greed of your own ego deep down, you are surrendering your compassion and your optimism and the light of hope and love in your heart and soul or whatever, and you are sacrificing, therefore, your humanity for power, temporally, physically, politically, imperialistically. And that's what Palpatine's done, and that's what he doesn't realize. And that's what he even tries to manage with his own cloned granddaughter in Rey, and he still fails. And the reason why he's going to fail is because the Dark always fails. That's a really positive underlying strand through all Star Wars. It might seem there's a yin-yang, Nuri-Puri, kind of light and dark, 50-50, push and pull between rebellion and empire, but the empire always falls. The empire is not eternal. Even though there's Knights of the Old Republic and the Old Republic and there's a great expansion called Knights of the Eternal Empire, there is no eternal empire. The only thing that never dies is the good stuff, the memories of good people, of good things, of good times, even when they die and we lose them. And that goes for our world and in Star Wars, in the galaxy far, far away. The good stuff is what you hold on to. If you lose a friend in the pandemic, they're still with you because you remember them. Same with family.
Yeah.
And it's the same with Star Wars. So in a way, self-fulfilling prophecies, we've had a really negative, dark spin on things because, Darth Maul, Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker, Darth Sidious, Palpatine, the Sheev fulfilling prophecy, we've kind of honed in on the negative side, but there can be a positive side as well. And I think it can link in nicely to what we kind of briefly mentioned you did in the last little bit that you spoke about, which was, is there free will, or is it the will of something else? Is there predestination, fate, and destiny? Or is there a little push-pull, nudge here, pull there, and currents of things that you kind of get swept up upon, and that determines your reality now and where you will be going very soon? It's a question that people have wrestled with throughout our existence as human life, and it's a question that we explore in creative terms in our narratives, including in Star Wars, whether it's on screen, on Disney Plus, in the video games, in the comics, in the novels, and I'm sure in the fan fiction too. So, to swing the lightsaber back to your way, Catherine, I say, is there free will more or less in Star Wars? Or is destiny the bigger thing that controls the prophecies?
And that's an interesting thing, because when it comes to some of these major events, depending on how we view these self-fulfilling prophecies coming about, it could be a form of predestiny or the Force nudging it in a direction. But certainly when you look at all the supporting characters and all the other things that happens minute by minute in the saga, it's more free will for sure. Free willing it all the way through there. But to your point about how good, and we were talking a lot about evil, for sure, but about good and positive effects of self-fulfilling prophecies would be Leia, or Padme even. Padme always she believes in democracy. Padme believes in trying to get everybody a voice and justice and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And even though she lives in a time where the Republic collapses, as shown in the deleted scenes of Revenge of the Sith, she's instrumental in creating the rebellion, because she's going to constantly have that positive outlook on life and is not going to let that fall apart. And that carries on with Leia. Leia always, no matter how feisty she is, or how much she'll give Luke and Han a hard time.
Yeah, you need that sassiness. The sassiness is her ultimate staying alive, yeah.
Yeah, and she is, and the reason you can't apply the myth of Sisyphus to Leia or Padme in the sense that they're constantly trying to achieve justice is because they are doing the right thing by going up against the forces of darkness, going up against the dark side, and preserving the good, so that they will eventually emerge from the light at the end of the tunnel, which is another very positive effect on it. But I see we have a question now from David. He says, or is it the failure of humans to trust in the will of the Force, as it is the failure of the Council to interpret the prophecy? Anakin did bring balance to the Force, but they didn't see that they should not have wanted that, as the Force was already out of balance in the Jedi's favor. That's actually a really good question. What do you think, Gio?
There's a quite a long question. Let me just go over it in my head again. I guess, okay, so the question is essentially, are the Jedi Council wrong?
Their failure to trust the will of the Force.
Yeah, well, let's go with just what we see on screen in the Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, before we go more widely. So, right or wrong, I don't know. I don't feel like I'm in the best place to judge the Jedi Council. But they were obviously a bit dodgy, very corrupt, a little egotistical without realizing it. And that's probably the worst thing. When someone does something bad, there's forgiveness for a reason. And there's learning for a reason. You either win or you learn. You don't never really lose or fail. But if you accept failure and you accept not winning, then you can learn and move on and progress as a person or as a civilization. The Jedi don't do that. They stagnated. And that's why Yoda didn't realize until Revenge of the Sith that it was too late and the Jedi had already fallen. He had an idea in the final 4 chapters of the Clone Wars when it was initially wrapped up in Season 6, the Lost Missions, when he meets the priestesses and there's a lot of mysticism with the Force, and Cypher Diaz returns. It's a very important aspect of the saga to look at if you want to explore self-fulfilling prophecies, because as in your opening, you mentioned Cypher Diaz and that aspect, and he's a key part in that storyline. So, the failure of the Jedi Council to interpret the prophecy is not necessarily their failure as individuals. It might be the overall failure in a belief system or a misinterpretation of spiritual and fantastical elements of what they think is controlling everything, the Force. Why should one person have the power, all that power? And why does it have to be a selected individual, a chosen person? There is no chosen one. There are millions and billions of them in the galaxy, and they could all be chosen if they embrace the Force and the will of the Force while making the decisions that are best for them and for the wider everything around them, out of compassion, out of love, out of selflessness, and in the pursuit of justice, peace, and truth. The Jedi didn't do that, and that they agreed to go for a sham war controlled by a puppet master.
Right, because Anakin, right, because to your point, Anakin in a sense isn't really a chosen one. It's just they believe that he is, but his only real function, Anakin's only function in the prequel trilogy is that because the Jedi have faith in him being the chosen one, that motivates them to take the wait-and-see approach with what the Sith are up to until it's too late, until you get to that scene in Episode 3 where Anakin, Mace Windu, or not Anakin, but Yoda, Mace Windu, and Obi-Wan are on a gunship second-guessing prophecy.
Yeah, I think that scene where Yoda slowly brushes his hair in great-looking CGI in sort of golden hour is the moment where Yoda realizes this war's already over. The Jedi Order is dead.
Right.
It's my fault because I was the most senior one and I didn't say anything because I thought things were okay and I thought the wait-and-see approach was all right. I didn't want to be too rash and too, I'm a Jedi, so I know better than the galaxy. But he should have done that, because if he'd done that to the other council members, they would have listened to him, because it's Yoda, Master Yoda. And secondly, if he'd done that with the Galactic Senate, they would have listened, because it's Yoda. It's not the Jedi Council or the Jedi Order, who a lot of people didn't trust anyway before the Clone Wars, for various reasons. It's a bit like, imagine if the Pope had this great idea and he saw something was coming. Pope Francis realizes, somebody tells him, an astrophysicist who's not in mainstream anything, finds out there's an asteroid that's going to hit Earth in 6 weeks' time, but only the Pope knows it because, they grew up in the same village in Argentina. Should the Pope tell everyone, or should he not? It's kind of like that. Yoda was kind of the Pope of the Catholic Church, of the Jedi Order, if you want to take a spin on things, for the prequel trilogy. And
that's definitely a big analogy that Lucas is using in the prequels. Like the Palpatine, he mentions at the rise of Julius Caesar, and the Jedi Order's headquarters is right down the street from the Galactic Senate, and obviously has a huge influence on those politics, much like Vatican City did.
Yeah.
But I think also to David's point, when it says, was the balance of the Force already tipped in the Jedi's favor, and it makes me think that, the Jedi never really defined in the prequels what the Chosen One prophecy was going to do for them, since to them they had already summoned the mountain. They thought that the Sith had been extinct for a millennium. They're very well respected. They have a good relationship with the Chancellor. And so we know why the Force institutes those things, is the Force can see that it's corrupt and wants to change everything. But it is true that the reason they misinterpret the prophecy, because they also never really define what they think it's going to achieve. It's almost like, this is an ancient thing that we don't have to worry about anymore because we're already here, which is why they're so incredulous at the notion that, can Anakin possibly be the Chosen One? Because, of course, the Chosen One would come forth at the time that you need him most, which Anakin does, but the Council can't see that because they already think they summoned the mountain, which is why they don't really trust the will of the Force either, because they never do address it. Like Qui-Gon, he can clearly see Anakin's journey, or at least he could see the end of it. I don't think Qui-Gon saw all the horrible things that Anakin was going to do.
No. But Anakin wasn't set to do them by the beginning.
He wasn't set to do them yet. So, but the fact that the Council can't see that in Anakin because they're so stuck in their ways, whereas Qui-Gon's not. He's on the outskirts, much like Count Dooku was on the outskirts. And it's kind of neat that even though Attack of the Clones doesn't give you much backstory on Dooku, the fact that when he mentions that, I'm Qui-Gon's master, that tells you so much more about him.
It does. It's a great connection. I'm glad they connected them like that way.
Yeah. So that leads us into our next question from Mike. He says, weren't the Sith actually the oppressed for the longest time by the Jedi? When Palpatine finally got into power, did he unite the Empire and brought running water to all the planets?
What a devil's advocate.
Yeah, but it is true that there's a lot of people in Star Wars that we've been seeing now, and Rebels, and even Mandalorian, who have been saying, or in the Bad Batch, who've been saying that the Empire actually helps them, because certainly when you're able to pillage and plunder all sorts of other worlds to do that, then you're able to help others.
Money to give to others, yeah.
Right. It's like he's the devil, and so he decides, which planets are the most valuable to me as an ally, and so I will take the worthless ones and steal all their resources and make them suffer to help the ones that I need on my side, which is kind of what it is.
This sounds like modern imperialism.
I guess it is. Yeah, I guess it is true that the Sith were oppressed by the Jedi because, as Lucas explains, Anakin is basically like an example of how the Sith first came into being. They were fallen Jedi, not like in the expanded universe where the Sith were this whole separate thing that came along at some point later on and were then oppressed by the Lords of the Sith. That was something different. But Lucas says no. The first there was the Jedi, and then you had the fallen Jedi who became the Sith. So it is true that they were oppressed for a long time to keep them down. And that, in a sense, you could argue is a self-fulfilling prophecy because the Jedi steps to, we can't let these guys come into power, and all the horrible things the Jedi did to try and keep them down makes them even angrier and further solidifies this idea in their heads that they have to destroy the Jedi, have to overthrow them. That's another great
galaxy for X amount of time. Don't be surprised when they push back by Y magnitude in the opposite vertical direction back up at you. So that's what you could say fits the analogy we're looking at here with the Sith being oppressed, but also with the rebellion and the resistance against the Empire, the First Order, the Final Order. I think it's a nice little summary of the entire kind of political struggle throughout the galaxy and the Galactic Civil War. But I would say that, so let's go back to the very beginning and let's take a mixture of expanded universe and Disney canonized official storyline stuff here. So I'm going to mention things from both, and if people want to want to know specifics, we can at the end I can tell you the sources and what's canon and what's EU. But so the original Tales of the Jedi and the beginning of the Jedi, Dawn of the Jedi, they knew about something grand that was drawing them to the planet. They settled on this moon. They decided there was a great mystical force that connected everything, and they started to talk about it and discuss it in roundtable discussions. They decided there was injustice around the galaxy, and people were being enslaved, people were being oppressed, cultures were being eradicated, speciesistic cleansing going on, ethnic cleansing, but against an entire species of alien that is humanoid. And that was happening to the Sith in the expanded universe. And what happened? A group of Jedi who wanted to use the Force for egotistical reasons decided we want to use the Force for our own good, not for the good of something greater than us. And that's hubris and ego, and they were outcasts for being people who were who had obsessions with materialism and vanity. The other Jedi thought, no, or the Jedi thought, no, let's get rid of these crazies who are very vain and self-obsessed. Because we don't think you should be so egotistical. We think you should have self-esteem and pride and courage, but you should share that and inspire others and lift them up and defend them. And the key things to defend are peace, justice, and truth. So if you don't want to defend those, but you want to use your greater connection to the universe and the Force for your own will bending and selfishness, then get out of here. You're not one of us. So that's an interesting thing, because it's a whole othering and sense of human tribalism that Star Wars writers who came up with that specific idea introduced into the expanded universe, and still kind of exists through Star Wars. The idea that it's humanity's primartia, it's our own fatal flaw for othering people. Just because someone has different beliefs from us doesn't mean they're any different to us really deep down. You know, molecular chemical terms, they're exactly the same as us. Okay? In superficial terms, they might look or dress or speak slightly differently to us, but they're exactly the same as us. And it goes for other species in Star Wars as well. The other humanoid species, or non-humanoid species, are no different from humans. They've got the same kind of human rights, the civil rights in the galaxy. But some people think they shouldn't have that. The Empire was very clearly an analog to kind of the Vietnam War and American imperialism in the 70s and the Japanese-Korean Wars, but also obviously Nazi Germany and the Secret Service and the rise of fascism in the 20th century. And it was brought back very obviously in The Force Awakens with Donald Gleason's portrayal of General Hux and his very kind of Hitler-esque speech about acquiesce to disorder. And this will be the last day of the Republic. And then they just blow everything up. All those planets that we really wanted to see as long-time Star Wars fans that weren't just Tatooine, just blew up. But that's The Force Awakens for you. J.J. Abrams wanted to lens flare it to the next level on a solar destroying. Yeah.
Like, wait, it's a beam. The laser's a beam splitter, but there's nothing there to split the beam.
It just decides. I think maybe you had 5 CG artists who were like, we want to blow this planet up. No, this planet up. No, this planet up. And J.J. went, okay, let's blow all of them up. And the storyboarders are like, well, does it say this in the script? And JJ's like, if you don't mention it, no one will ask questions. Everyone did. But yeah, so Starkiller Base was crazy. But the whole, everything about kind of fascism and political stuff, it goes back to what Mike was saying. Were the Sith oppressed? Yes, they were. Were they oppressed as Dark Jedi? Yes, they were. Were they oppressed because they had different beliefs to the mainstream Jedi? Yes, they were. They were othered. There was tribalism. There was division. There was classism and casteism, and that caused a hierarchical dysfunction. And so people would have also left the Jedi Order saying, we don't want to be part of this egotistical, we are holier than thou, we believe this, you believe that, you are not part of us anymore. And that's what the Jedi kind of did. And it's touched on in Knights of the Old Republic and the Old Republic video games really well, as well as the ancillary material, graphic novels, and things like that. But the Sith then went to a planet where they realized they were better than everyone because they had the power of the Force. They could do whatever they wanted. And a ship crash landed on Korriban. And I don't know if they were exiled there or it was an accident, but then they called other Dark Jedi to there and were saying, hey look, we've got this entire historic planet, there's ancient remains of other cultures, we can learn stuff, we can do experiments in the dark side and the Force, and learn and progress and be better Jedi. And they discovered there were these Sith species, humanoid people who could speak and were very intelligent, had their own amazing cultures and tribes, and they dominated them, and some of them wanted to enslave them, some of them wanted to work with them. And that's why you got Sith being adopted as the Sith, Lords of the Sith, the people who were the overlords of the planet of the Sith species. And a lot of them were kind of dark red-skinned, and maybe a bit scaly, I'm not really sure. Knights of the Old Republic and the Old Republic has a few people on. They kind of look a little bit like Klingons, but red. They're a very warring tribal species, but imagine it's just another indigenous tribe, like you'd have anywhere on our Earth. And they were enslaved and oppressed. So actually, going back to the original comment, the Sith Lords oppressed the Sith species and culturally appropriated their entire existence. So maybe the greatest ill was done onto the Sith by the Sith Lords themselves, and a lot of them happen to be basic, Orabesh fluent, English-speaking, basic in the Star Wars universe, humanoid or human Sith Lords, and many of them were men. So one could say that's an analogy to modern-day struggles with, privilege and patriarchy. But that's besides the point. I think the Sith were oppressed by the Jedi. I think the Sith oppressed the actual native species of the Sith, and they appropriated everything about their beliefs and indoctrinated their own offspring. And then some of them had a kind of master race type thing, and were thinking, if we create a new species or group of people that is partly Sith blood and partly
like a head skull.
Yeah, then we can create a master species of force-infused warriors who are physically strong and imposing, like the Sith species are, and have all their culture and language and history, but then have, human history, or Twi'lek history, or Grand history, or Weequay history, other Trandoshan, other species and all their traits, creating essentially eugenics in a Friedrich Nietzschean way, which was then obviously most famously adopted by a crazy Austrian vegan guy in the 20th century. So there's a lot of parallels there, and obviously I'm projecting loads of what I've read and what I think is cool and what I think is horrible onto stuff that may have no...
Well, I think you have it right on point when you're saying about the Jedi oppressing the Sith, because as Lucas explains because you have there with the whole Sith species, that's in the expanded universe, but even in the new canon version that George Lucas had established, that how the Sith were fallen Jedi, you look at how Anakin in a sense was oppressed by the Jedi because he wanted to... Yeah, his whole mission statement for leaving his mother was because he wanted to come back and save them. He wanted to be a hero and liberate the slaves. It's not a mistake on George's part where the episode 1 the very beginning of the Skywalker saga is showing the Jedi doing this personal political favor for the Chancellor. They're even kind of bored with themselves, and it's just further making the point that no, this is not who the Jedi are about. And I think a lot of fans missed that with Phantom Menace. They thought, oh, what's George doing? He's destroying it. It's politics, it's trade, it's boring. It's like, no. He's making the point that this is what the purpose of the Skywalker saga was. It was to set the Jedi back on the right path, and because they'd gone down the dark path, the Sith had been able to rise. But since Anakin, you could see, was oppressed, and according to George Lucas, Anakin's fall to the dark side parallels how the first Sith came into being. Well, that's it. It's the Jedi sort of oppressing their own members and trying to, make them these very uniform troops, if you will, that kind of caused a break in the ranks. And that's what really sent it down that path. And so I really liked the idea that the Sith were, like you said, they were oppressed. They ended up being turned into something that they weren't necessarily. Like they wanted to, like George says, no villain wakes up wanting to be evil like a Snidely Whiplash type guy. There's a reason for it. Like even in the Dark Plagueis book, they dived into a little bit of the reasons why Palpatine ended up going down that path, which is not addressed in the film. So, and then he connected that back to what you're talking about, the myth of Sisyphus, and the reason that will always apply to the dark side is because the dark side is greedy and avaricious. It will never be satisfied. It will always want more, which is why they will never be able to finish their real goal of anything. Whereas the Jedi, the good side, they are very selfless and very caring for other people, and they're not always going to be out trying to grab everything, which is why they will always find a way to be satisfied and reach an end to their journey, if you will, where the Sith and the dark side never will. And in a sense, that's almost like itself a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you decide that you always want unlimited power, as Palpatine says, then by definition, you're never going to succeed.
You won't, because nothing's unlimited. Everything ends. And maybe the only thing that doesn't end is the good stuff. And that could go into the end of the Jedi Code, where there is no death.
Like David just wrote, Anakin, from my point of view, the Jedi are evil.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he was just a little confused kid. He just wanted a pod racer.
I wouldn't go so far to say the Jedi are evil. They just kind of lost their way for a little bit, and it became susceptible. It's like it's kind of like in Fight Club when Tyler Durden eventually, or when the narrator finally finds out that Tyler Durden is not an actual person but another split personality, and Tyler tells him, and when he asks Tyler, why are you here? And he says, you needed a change in your life. You could not do this on your own, so I came along and did it for you. Which is sort of like what the Chosen One is for. So the Jedi Order needed to change. They needed to get back on track. They couldn't do this on their own, so they allowed, in a sense, the Force allowed a new Sith to be created to do it. It's like that great yin-yang type balance, which of course came back with a vengeance in The Last Jedi, with the whole striking the balance between the light and the dark, and the recognition that there has always been a light and dark.
Yeah.
But the Sith, of course, unbalance the Force more than the Jedi, because the Sith are always going to strike to want more power, whereas the Jedi don't. It's just that you need to have it's like a balance doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have some Sith and some Jedi. It's just people aren't going to try and mess with things and be selfless about it.
Yeah. It's the balance of the Force is not about light versus dark, because the Force isn't. It's going to sound very overtly religious now. The Force isn't a religious thing. The Force is not the kind of very orthodox version of God that some of our world cultures might propagate, in that, like a man saying, thou shalt do this, these are good, thou shalt not do those things, that's bad. The Force is its own organic, original entity from which everything else is derived. It's the original energy, it's the Big Bang, it's the Force, it's the first thing, it's that old, original light. And we have similar belief systems in our world, which inspired George Lucas with the whole East Asian karma and dharma type beliefs. And that's what the Jedi were. The Jedi were mystical and spiritual and morally conscious, and they were not attached to the physical realm or obsessed with material and temporal power, but they became diverted from that, as all institutions become. I think one of the biggest takeaway messages of Star Wars is that institutions suck and are corrupt and need revitalizing or revolutionizing, or burning down and rebirthing, a proper renaissance every couple of decades, because nothing can stay uncorrupt. And the Jedi Order needed that. They just needed a reformation. They needed a renaissance, but they didn't.
That's something that really runs through George Lucas as well, because he's very anti-establishment in all his films. Like THX 1138 is basically, to me, I think it's the better version of 1984. Because the first half of that is you get to see the same type of Orwellian society, but this character's like, I gotta get the hell out of here. Or in American Graffiti, you have your main protagonist basically being anti-establishment, screw the man type thing. And then you see another Lucasfilm movie that was made, was called Tucker, the Man in His Dream. I think Tucker, who designed his own very super advanced car, and got crushed by the auto company because they didn't want to, and just completely steamrolled the little guy. And so it's like George is very much against this bigger bad guy oppressing the little guy, and he'll be the first to point out the irony that he ended up turning Lucasfilm into an empire all its own.
Well, that's the self-fulfilling prophecy. Wow. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it came full circle on a meta level. It's totally awesome. And so, we're answering our own questions by talking out loud, because I kept asking myself for this episode, it's like, God, why are the writers doing this? What does this really mean? And now we've become full circle. So I guess in a sense, I've answered my own question. It's not necessarily an author pre-writing the history of events so much as
humanity. It's a circularity. It's a circular narrative within human stories and the human condition and conscience that we all share.
Yeah, and human psychology just kind of allows that to happen.
Yeah, I looked up actually the definition of self-fulfilling prophecy just as we were beginning, and then we had some initial teething problems with the technology and hiccups with the network. And it was formalized in an academic paper in 1948 by Richard Merton, essentially as a psychosociological concept of predetermined anxiety over the way something will or won't go, and therefore it happens a particular way, and then you feel as if it was your fault for that happening. I paraphrased there, but the beginning was the definition verbatim. But yeah, they essentially, obviously, he's not the person who invented the name or the idea of it. Yeah, there are no original ideas, really. Everything's just common knowledge that we forget and then rediscover as time goes on. And that's what the Jedi did. They forgot who they were. There was an identity crisis. They probably should have had a proper schism, the way the churches have done before, or the way the Jedi Order did. when the first Dark Jedi left and became Sith, or during the Jedi Civil War of the Knights of the Old Republic era, 3,600 years before the Phantom Menace. But there hasn't been enough exploration of that in the new canon yet. I feel it was a really missed opportunity to not touch upon any of these themes overtly in the storyline and central structure, narratively, of the trilogy that began with The Force Awakens. As mentioned before, I have tremendous respect for J.J. Abrams, Lawrence Kasdan, and Kathleen Kennedy, but I think the general unanimous opinion from most Star Wars fans, whether you're 13 or 300 years old, is the sequel trilogy could have benefited from a proper 3-act structure, in the way that the original trilogy is almost one film in 3 parts, and so is the Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith. If you look at what happens, the character, and the themes in them, it's a 3-act movie in 3 2-hour and 20-minute installments, and the Star Wars, The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker do not feel that way. They don't have the same rhythm and timing.
Right. Because I think, actually, to your point, the prequel trilogy is probably the best example of the 3-act structure, because George knew all the steps in advance. Because he knew at the time, because he knew that, unlike the original trilogy, where he didn't know if he was going to be able to make all 3 movies, and all due respect to George, is a bit of a revisionist. We know he didn't really have all 3 stories in mind from the start. Whereas with the prequels, he did know he was going to do all 3 of them. He actually did have it mapped out, so it flows a lot.
In his mind for 18 years as well, from the end of Return of the Jedi. There's that great, there's that really amazing interview with Mark Hamill just before The Empire Strikes Back, where I think it's somewhere in maybe Ealing Studios or Pinewood, just off the set. And so he's in, I think, the Hoth jumpsuit, but you're pretty much just from the shoulders up, and you kind of see Mark Hamill at an angle, and I think he's had his makeup done on his face for looking a little battered or whatever. And he's asked by an English reporter, so do you have an idea of what would happen next in your career, or would you come back and play this character again? And Mark Hamill says, sure, yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing, what happens to Luke if he comes back and he's a bit of a pirate. It's made him sound like an emo character almost. He's like in all black, with earrings and chains, like a biker dude, or come back as an old man, and I could be the Obi-Wan, I could be the Ben, the Alec Guinness type, to a young boy or young girl. George has a plan. He's already mentioned he'll bring us back, and maybe 20, 30 years, you're all a bit older and more grey. So the idea of continuing the Star Wars films after The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi were over was already known, actually, in 1980. And it was formalized, I think, when the Expanded Universe kicked off.
Right. But I know that George Lucas's biographer said that even though he had to sign an NDA, George showed him the 9-episode Skywalker saga plan that he had back in the early 80s. And in that version, you didn't even meet the Emperor until, like, episode 7 or 8, and he didn't die until, like, episode 9. So by the time he showed him that structure, they had already gone off the rails, since Return of the Jedi had already come out, and the Emperor was already dead. So it's like, it's still following that idea.
There's the Empire and Dark Empire were fine with George Lucas, their official Star Wars content in the Expanded Universe, and hey, what happens in them? You pretty much have the Empire coming back, and the Emperor coming back.
And that's because the writers, they enjoy the original trilogy, so they're going to keep recycling it, which is why George didn't really co-sign it. I can't remember who it was, but George was being interviewed by one of the major TV journalists here in America in the early 90s. And the journalist asked him at some point, he's like, why didn't you make more Star Wars sequels with Han, Luke, and Leia? There's a fan base out there that clearly wants it. And he said, because Luke is a very cinematic character. And he elaborated by saying that all the steps in Luke's character arc occur in the original trilogy. You see that classic hero's journey, and the fact that he throws down that saber, he forgoes violence as a means to an end. And so that expanded version, that expanded universe version of Luke, which everybody, myself included, loves to read about, doesn't jive with the official canon, because that's not really who Luke was anymore. He still has some of that inner darkness within him, like the fact that he nearly murders Darth Vader in Return of the Jedi, not because of anything Vader did, but just because Vader floated the idea of turning Leia. And so that's why I found it consistent that he would consider killing his nephew for something that his nephew hadn't yet done either. But
Yeah, because he sees his nephew in that moment. He sees him as the cause of all the terrorism and warmongering and death of the galaxy.
And to Luke's credit, unlike when Vader threatened to turn Leia, where Luke didn't snap out of it until he had nearly finished him off, in Kylo's case, all he had to do was ignite the blade to snap out of it. So it's like,
So he has definite character growth and development, and he's progressed as a person on the same arc that he was on earlier in the films, 33 years before. I don't know why people complain so much. Anyway, it's the story.
but I guess, but to your point overall, it's that yes, there is a continuing cycle, and you see how the story, self-fulfilling prophecies does become a matter of human nature and human psychology more than it is necessarily somebody writing it. Because I mean, I know that the Wills never made their way into canon specifically. I mean, they alluded. The closest thing we've seen to the Wills would be the Force priestesses in Clone Wars, because they're living at the heart of the galaxy and they're giving Yoda his guidance. And at the end of that saga, the priestesses kind of disappear, and you realize they aren't real. So it's almost like it's the Force speaking to Yoda in a tangible way that he can understand it, and it's sort of speaking its mind, which is really shocking because that's the like when you said that when Qui-Gon says something like, "Oh, listen to the Force," it's telling you. Not like he's literally hearing a voice in his head. Whereas when Yoda goes to the heart of the galaxy, he is literally hearing that voice and seeing that voice that he's communicating with. But yeah, that's kind of the thing. It's like, as fans, we love to tell the same stories over and over again. Like, as much, I think one of the most popular expanded universe stories is Knights of the Old Republic. But that story, much like the first two trilogies, it's told out of order, starting at a halfway point, and it's basically retelling the same story in a nutshell that the first two trilogies tells, just with a few different stand-ins, because people love telling the same stories. It goes back to Joseph Campbell. You know, the fact that the Noah's Ark myth predates Christianity by showing up in 76 different pagan religions before it started up with Christianity. You know, people, for whatever reason, just love telling these stories. And of course, we fans are no different. That's why we love having, the Dark Empire trilogy and all the stuff that Luke went on to do, even though it disavowed the end of his character arc in the original trilogy. So I do really, it's kind of neat how all this stuff kind of works back around to itself.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
Very well.
So I don't think we have any more questions. You want to wrap this up, perhaps?
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for tuning in to another chapter of the Unifying Force, my second, the third overall. Listening to Catherine and I. Thank you very much to the Jedi Council and the Star Wars Celebration Anaheim 2022 group on Facebook, from where we are broadcasting live and streaming, as well as Zoom, and those members who specifically are producing the show, and you don't necessarily see the faces or hear the voices of, but they're just as involved, and this is just as much their efforts and endeavors as it is ours. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to be on this journey, beginning with you, our own little hero's journey via Zoom, Facebook Live. And thank you for tuning in and spending a couple of minutes or maybe the full hour with us on a Sunday, especially with teething issues of technology and then doing network stuff. So I'll really look forward to, in 2 weeks' time, continuing the conversation on. If you have any questions, suggestions, recommendations, please write in the comments now, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Or feel free to message us or write on the group, and we'll very happily bring in your ideas, your feedback, and get to your questions, because we'd like to continue the discussion in an informal way and in an on-demand way, and the best way is using digital media like Facebook groups to do so. This has been really fun. I've had a pretty crazy week and a ridiculously packed weekend. I was actually stuck in the car on the way here, and then we had some technology things to untangle, but it's all worked out pretty well in the end. I'm just hoping the other things I have going on in my life in the background in sports are happening the way I want them to happen. I'm about to maybe see if England actually won their first match against Croatia, the last team to beat them in the World Championship football, but that's not Star Wars. And then also to see if the French Open final is going to be won by a modern-day Hercules called Stephanie Tsitsipas. So anyway, let's wrap this up. Thank you so much for listening. Catherine, I'll let you say a few words. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah, so make sure to join us every Tuesday at 4 Pacific for the virtual Cantina happy hour. It's really awesome. And then every Thursday nights at 7 Pacific We have our Cantina watch-alongs, and join Mike and others in company next Sunday for the next episode of Jedi Archives.
Jedi Archives,
a really great series, and that's shaping up to be great. I hope to be on there sometime. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a great week. See you later.
Thank you. This is The Way. May the Force be with you. Happy Sunday.